מה טובו לך יעקב משכנותיך ישראל מה טובו לך יעקב משכנותיך ישראל ואני ברוב חסדך אבוא ותך אשתחווה אליך אל קודשך ביראתך
It's September 17th, 1849. A hot spell has just snapped, and it's a clear, beautiful evening. The men pull down their window shades and close the doors of their shops. The sun is low on the horizon over the Sacramento River. There'll be a pretty sunset soon. It's a good night to usher in the Jewish New Year. The men walk toward the small Front Street home of a clothing merchant named Moses Hyman.
Hello, Lois. Hello, Joseph. New, how's business?
Good, Lois, good.
The rabbi leading the Rosh Hashanah service tonight will be the Reverend Mr. Wolf. These worshipers will go on to form one of the pioneer synagogues of the American West, Congregation B'nai Israel. The men heading for the Hyman House pass a multitude of canvas and wooden buildings that seem to have sprung up overnight. Gold was discovered in Coloma the previous year, and business between the miners and the merchants is brisk. Fortunes are about to be made, and in the years that follow, the world will rush into California. Most of the Jewish immigrants traveled from Poland and Germany. Others came from France, Russia, and England. Many braved their way around Cape Horn directly to San Francisco, a trip that cost $200 in steerage and took up to 6 months.
They came from Europe, they came to the East Coast, they learned the language, and they felt that they could do better by moving west. So some of them thought they might want to be prospectors and search for gold, as other prospectors did. But when they got here, they found that a lot of them found it was very difficult, and they thought they could do better by not only having their families with them, but by getting supplies to the miners.
Most of these Jewish settlers returned to the trades they had known in Europe. In the early 1850s, some 9,000 people lived in Sacramento. About 200 of them were Jews. Sacramento had become the leading city in the region. Development was sprawling out from Front Street. By this time, the Jewish community had organized into a congregation named the Children of Israel. A Methodist church, the first church building in Sacramento, was consecrated in 1849. This tin-roofed wooden chapel was shipped around the Horn from Baltimore to San Francisco, and then to Sacramento. The Methodists placed it at 7th and L Streets. The young Jewish congregation bought the church building in June 1852, and the new synagogue was consecrated in September. It was the first synagogue west of the Mississippi River to be owned by its members. Congregation B'nai Israel had a home of its own. Over the years, B'nai Israel occupied many buildings. The original synagogue burned in the Great Fire of November 1852. In 1904, the 6th Street building was sold, and the cornerstone was laid for the new 15th Street Temple. President Albert Elkis noted with pride that the new temple, to be built and furnished for $16,000, would be debt-free.
The old temple on 15th Street was a 2-story building in the corner of the alley. The sanctuary was upstairs, and downstairs they had a social hall and a very fine stage and a kitchen.
As Sacramento's Jewish population boomed after World War II, the 15th Street Temple, now occupied for 40 years, began to show its age.
Of course, we were fighting to keep the temple from falling down. The joke was that they kept it together with baling wire. Finally, White Dalton said, let's build a new temple.
Dalton Feldstein, the president of B'nai Israel in 1947, was the guiding light of the new temple on Riverside Boulevard, the house that Dalton built.
The new temple was a vision of Dalton. There were a number of reasons for leaving the old temple, but there was no access for anyone with any handicaps. It was too small. But primarily it was because Dalton wanted a new temple.
Architect Bill Koblick, a member of the congregation, drew up the blueprints. Dalton Feldstein, Rabbi Hausman, Harry Kaufman, and Harry Tonkin collected $250,000 to start the groundbreaking.
In Hebrew, we schnorred. Milt Levinson and I went out every night after dinner. We'd go out snoring for 2 and 3 hours.
We had so many affairs, so many fundraising affairs, and so many people gave more money than they thought they could afford. But we finally built this temple, and we were all very proud of it because it was a new home for our Jewish family.
The sanctuary and the social hall owe a great deal, of course, to Dalton Feldstein and to Harry Lev and to Manny Schwartz. Manny gave all of the drapery for the social hall, and Harry Lev gave all the beautiful wood that's in the sanctuary.
Dalton donated most of the bema, the ark, that whole wall, the reading table, the decorative gold stuff on the front, and the chairs.
The new temple was dedicated in 1954. In the early 1960s, the Buddy Candell Education Wing was added. By 1985, Temple B'nai Israel had been on Riverside Boulevard for more than 30 years. The congregation's membership had grown from 200 individuals to 700 families. It was time to modernize and expand. Past president and architect Al Dreyfus agreed to oversee the design and construction of the temple's renovation. In June 1986, groundbreaking ceremonies were held for the new chapel, library, and office building. The Harry M. Tonkin Memorial Chapel and the Sosnick Library were dedicated in November 1987. The most recent building project, the Opera Courtyard, began in the summer of 1997. It was designed in a style reminiscent of Old Jerusalem. The courtyard is surrounded by a stone walkway engraved with the names of B'nai Israel families. The courtyard was dedicated in April 1998. In the early morning darkness of June 18, 1999, B'nai Israel suffered a cruel and wrenching blow.
Flames of hate left a devastating scar on Temple B'nai Israel in Sacramento. A pre-dawn arson fire engulfed the temple's library.
In a heartening show of support, Gentile clergy, politicians, and a human tide of racially and spiritually diverse people came together to denounce this terrible crime. Rallies were held. Contributions poured in. Thousands of ordinary people shared our shock and our grief. We were not alone.
We gather because the synagogues of Sacramento were burned.
For our sisters and brothers whose lives have been shattered, may they be uplifted by this our acts of outpouring and love.
Send a loud and clear message to those who torched the 3 synagogues that their crime will find no haven, no sanction, no silent assent.
This is the first time that I've stood in this room. it's hard to find the right words. And when I put my hand in this light, I see hope. Hope for a future where children will come and play, where we will learn, and we will study, and we will pray, and we will be a part of a greater whole of the Jewish people. Chazak v'yamatz, we will have courage and we will be strong, and we will prevail.
Ironically, I think that much more good will come out of the bombing than any harm that was inflicted on us. I think we're going to come across as a stronger congregation, a more involved congregation. I believe that the congregants have come into this with a very healthy attitude. They haven't come away feeling like victims at all. They've come away strengthened by the community support, and they've come away with a stronger commitment to Judaism.
In its long history, B'nai Israel has suffered the ravages of fire several times. But the true temple doesn't reside in its buildings. It's in the soul and spirit of its members.
Over the past 150 years, B'nai Israel has adapted to the changing times and needs of its members. The journey hasn't always been smooth. The earliest controversy was over whether to follow German or Polish religious customs. When B'nai Israel adopted its first constitution in 1857, the congregation chose to worship in the German tradition.
There was a lot of dissension between the Polish Jews and the German Jews, and they were so at odds with each other that one group left.
The loss of B'nai Israel's building to fire in 1861 motivated the two groups to reunify. Rabbi Abram Simon remembered.
The loss sustained reaped a splendid gain, for the flames licked up much of the rancor and hatred. The sorrow brought in its train good fellowship, and in a short while the two congregations united under the old familiar name, B'nai Israel.
For the next few decades, B'nai Israel's services continued to follow the Orthodox traditions. They were conducted on Saturday mornings.
The congregation enter and perform their devotions with their heads covered. The ceremony consists of the prayers in Hebrew, the reading of the law by the appointed reader, and others called up out of the congregation. The men are habited in the scarf with the memorial fringes.
In 1877, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise came to Sacramento during a tour of the West to drum up support for the new American Reform movement. 2 years later, B'nai Israel began holding shorter services in English, using Wise's prayer book, the Minhag America. Only 3 men were called up to the Torah, instead of the 7 formerly required. B'nai Israel also dispensed with the shachet, or ritual slaughterer.
4 women ordered 4 lamb's tongues or calf's tongues for a certain Friday night Sabbath dinner. And it was known that only 1 kosher beef was killed. And the women didn't know how they got 4 kosher tongues from 1 beef. So they decided that the shochet was not on the up and up, and he was let go.
In 1880, B'nai Israel publicly proclaimed itself a congregation of Reformed Israelites.
Progress in religious matters they claimed to be as necessary and commendable as in political and social life. Hence, so far as the genius of their peculiar faith will allow, they seem resolved to keep up with the times and to conform to modern customs.
Reform Judaism provided the pathway for Jews to have it both ways, to be Jews and to be Americans.
But differences between Reform and Orthodox congregants continued. In the years before the turn of the century, membership numbers fluctuated as conflicts waxed and waned. But a series of outstanding lay leaders provided the guidance the congregation needed.
Even in those days, it was difficult to get a minyan, and so they had similar problems that they have today. There were also many discussions about whether or not they should wear hats, and they finally decided that the men could do as they liked. So when they had this discussion, the men who wore hats all sat on one side, and those who did not sat on the other side.
Throughout the 1890s, a group of highly observant Jews prayed together in the back of Jacob Bloomberg's hat store. In 1900, several Orthodox members of B'nai Israel joined them to form Hevra Toras Moshe, today's Mosaic Law congregation. In 1885, B'nai Israel formally joined the Reform movement. The pendulum continued to swing from very liberal to more traditional and back again. But in the first half of the 20th century, the atmosphere was distinctly Reform.
Our wedding was in the sanctuary at the temple in 1940, and we were going to have a Reform wedding, but we were going to be married under a chuppah. And the men were not going to wear hats. Well, my little Orthodox mother from Brooklyn was there, and she had a fit. So Frank had to go out and get a number of hats, otherwise she would have left the wedding.
The services were rather thin.